All right, welcome to Equal Time Soccer. We are here for a Gopher Soccer pregame show. I'm here alongside the legend, Danny Foxhoven Young. Danny, we are in the throes of Big Ten play now, which means the kookiness of conference play is among us. Who beats who and why someone beats who is like completely impossible to predict
Yeah.
at this point of like, wait, that team only gave up what to who? Like, it's just complete wild. You've played at our level, you've coached, you've watched so much of the game. Talk about sort of what it is about conference play that brings that element of sort of unpredictability and kookiness.
Yeah. Well, first of all, happy Sunday, everybody. Sunday soccer is the best. It is the most exciting time of the year because fall is here, and I feel like it makes for the perfect soccer weather. So I know we're all excited about that. But yeah, so to kind of answer your question, I guess right now is when conference play brings out a different level of stakes, where it really is your points really add up and become really important come your goals for the end of the season. A lot of times, some conferences don't always have like a tournament conference where like the
Right.
winner goes on. A lot of times, it is the winners of these conferences at the end of their conference play will then make it to the tournament. And
Right.
even then, usually the big ones like Big Ten do get a bid into the tournament if you win or if you come in like
Right.
first or second, so these points, these matches become really, really important. Even getting a tie is sometimes just as important as getting a win, because that 1 point can make a difference. So I think you do start seeing all of these weird scores because teams will know like, okay, this is our one chance either to win a game against a big team. Maybe it's their toughest game in their
Right.
whole season ROI. And so, and it's kind of like forced upon them. Like, it's out of the hands of the coaches to say who they want to play. This is your
Right.
schedule. So
Right.
I think that brings a new kind of mentality where teams can either play up or down to the level of
Right.
other teams. And that, I think, like you mentioned, it can bring some kooky scores, which, to be honest, that's the exciting part about this. It is. So it
Well,
makes
and
it
you
fun.
Well, and you mentioned even getting a tie can be so big. The idea of coming away with some points, and Minnesota in their first Big Ten game had the heartbreaking side of that, where you play kind of a drag out game where they are, as I say, way too much like playing to competition. Like they're letting Nebraska dictate the way the game goes. They weren't necessarily playing terribly, but the game is just dragging on. It's 0-0. But then you give up a goal in the 88th minute. And after that sort of 88 minutes of slog, you cost yourself not only that point, but you let Nebraska get 3 points, at home. And I think, as I mentioned, I think I've probably been, too quick to use that phrase of playing to competition. I think this year what you've seen is not necessarily the level of play, but if a higher level team or a team is willing to play forward, like Indiana did on Thursday, Indiana, their natural style is to be incredibly intentional, sit back, only go forward, when they have a very good opportunity. And against Minnesota, they completely flipped that script. The coaching staff threw that game plan in the trash. They threw numbers forward from jump. And then Minnesota, a team that struggles playing in those tight spaces, but loves to play in wide open space, gets a 3-0 win because Indiana decides to throw forward. And I think, a team like Northwestern is so good, and you could say that Minnesota is playing to competition, but they're also just taking the space that's given to them, good. So in a way, it's sort of like playing good teams, quote unquote, helps because they're willing to go forward and then they open up space for you. Talk about sort of that give and take of, well, yeah, we're playing the number 9 team in the country, so it's not like we would like invite this game, but at
Yeah.
least maybe since they're on the front foot, we have some space to live and breathe.
Well, I think there's a couple things because one, if you just talk about like the mentality of how Minnesota is going into this game, as I mentioned
Right.
before, this is probably one of their highest ranked games that they're going to play all season.
For sure.
This is a game that is forced upon them, right, by the schedule of being in the Big Ten. It's not necessarily something that's going to be outside of, whereas like Northwestern has gone and played Stanford and a couple of
Right.
things. Like this is going to be the big game for Minnesota. So I
Right.
do think that they have this is going to be a game where I think you're going to see the coaches and everybody saying, let's go for it. Let's get after it. Let's do everything we can today to get a win. At the very least, let's get a tie. Like a point out of this game would be a big point. Right. So I do think that there's that mentality. And with that, they're probably encouraging them to try new things with the knowledge of being disciplined still. Right. And that's a really, really tough balance to strike. And I think that kind of plays into what you were talking about. Like, how do we play in these kind of games? And you always have to think about, okay, what are the strengths of the opponents? What are our strengths? And how are we gonna highlight those things today to be the best against our opponent, right? So, when we find that the game gets really opened up and expanded, then we go we go fast. We try to get a goal as soon as we can, and then if we lose it, we compact really quickly. We get back around the ball, we drop back, and we stay really disciplined in that. But that is that's gonna take a lot of effort on everybody's hands today, you know.
Well, and you mentioned, two things you mentioned there, the idea of, transitioning a defense so hard, that being a lot of effort. And then also you mentioned the willingness to try new things. I think both of those things really speak to how the rotations are managed. And I think, I'm probably guilty of over focusing on like sub minutes, rotation minutes. The last time you were on a show, I was almost obsessively talking about how few subs the Gophers have used. The truth is, the last few games, I think the Gopher coaching staff has shown a ton of willingness to change what they do and tweak what they do. Like you said, it's not wholesale changing the system. It's, well, okay, if these are our guiding principles, what if we throw, a Sophia Romine who's been more of a 10? What if we actually let her play on the front line and see if her chaos and creativity does something more unique in the center of the front line of a 4-3-3? Just like, let's see what she can do with that high pressing energy and just the offensive chaos and creativity she can bring. And then, multiple tweaks to the starting lineup last game where Sadie Harper comes in and starts. Freshman Amelia Brown starts at holding midfield, like a crucial position, and does well and performs well. And so I think the Gopher staff has shown a lot of what you spoke to, the idea of how do you balance sort of keeping your principles steady and then also sort of adding some new things that maybe teams can't scout you on too. Maybe that's a piece of it as well. But I think speak a little bit to that, of the challenge of like trying to tweak that rotation and tweak players' roles, especially you're talking about like Kenna Beisman's role has shifted a little bit. Megan Gray's role has shifted a little bit. Izzy Brown's role has shifted a little bit. These are like seniors and graduate level starters and core contributors where you're asking them to just like game by game. Maybe I'm asking you a little bit something different. Talk about what that takes as a coaching staff to sort of balance all those team dynamics.
Well, I think that in the collegiate soccer world, it is such a unique task on these players and the coaches because the season is condensed into essentially 3 months. I mean, it's kind of crazy. Like if you make it past that, then, you have maybe an additional 6 weeks on that. But like really, it's a very short amount of time. And you are putting a ton of miles, a ton of load, a ton of pressure on those 3 months. So I think the seniority becomes really apparent into, if they have been through this kind of a really high pressure, high situation season before, that gives them a leg up. So you mentioned like the players who are, senior graduate levels, like that's where their leadership and seniority, the coaches can start to lean on them to say, okay, now you guys are familiar with our principles. You know what we expect of you. You know how to handle this, your bodies, your emotions, your head, you guys know how to handle this. So now if we can keep you in there, maybe ask you to shift around a little bit, a couple different things, you can then create space for these freshman players who maybe haven't had that experience, even the sophomore players, who are starting to get their feet underneath them a little bit. But don't know, they don't know all of the ins and outs of it yet. We can help them kind of come along, create some space for them to be creative in their own right, bring their fresh energy. So I think that that's where you can really start to lean on certain players to show up in different ways and encourage your younger players to come through and bring something new to the team. So I think that is a really, really unique thing about college soccer.
Yeah.
And I think that as coaches, that's one of probably their joys, but also probably one of the toughest things that they have to do, because you start
Yeah.
to see these player coaches too, right? Where the players then take on a little bit more of that leadership role too. So I think that you'll start to see that, and the coaches can lean, you'll see them lean on these older players to show up today.
Right. Well, yeah, you said I say this all the time. Like, college soccer is absurd. Like, the level of grind is so crazy, and what it takes to be successful in college soccer is so different than the pros, and it's also different than like the summer league teams that we've covered on Equal Time and that you follow. It's not the same thing, and the pressures are not the same, and it is just really brutal. Like, it is a brutal landscape to succeed in. And I think, speaking to today's matchup, you mentioned some of those veteran players, really will be tasked for Minnesota with trying to up their game and sort of take on this challenge.
Yeah.
That challenge against Northwestern is, multifaceted. They only give up a half a goal a game, which is just like an incredibly stout defensive unit. I think the only silver lining and the only bit of sunlight that Minnesota has is that, against Nebraska, Northwestern gave up 2 goals, against a team that frankly likes to slog it out and doesn't play a ton of offense. Both goals were a little bit of chaos. End of the first half on a corner kick, there's that scramble, and great job by the Huskers to finish it. And then another one was just a basic defensive mishap where 2 defenders thought they were going for a ball, and I think it was Robbie or some mainstay Nebraska attacker just rips it across the goal and hits the far upper corner, just takes advantage of chaos.
Yeah.
And so I think for Minnesota, what you might need to see is a bit of that, of maybe if there are ever times where the Northwestern defensive unit has any mishap, like, Minnesota will have to pounce on that, because otherwise it may be tough to break down this defensive unit. And I think, on the flip side, Megan Plashko and the Gopher defensive crew, I think, will be really tested. I mean, they've had a ton of shutouts this year. They shut out Indiana, but Indiana, is a team that maybe isn't super offensive and doesn't do a lot of work in the final third, but I think they're going to get tested a bunch. And we saw they gave up that late goal against Nebraska. They've given up a ton of late goals this year. And as I've said, affectionately, that defensive unit is old as shit. They should have more composure than this. Like, there's 3 graduate students, a junior and a senior are the 5 like defenders and keeper. Like, the junior is the youngest person on the back line. Like, they should have the composure. But I think a lot of it is how the team defends as a whole, because I think there's been times where a giveaway in the midfield, Coach Chastain was quick to, try and catch me when I asked, does the defensive unit need to sharpen up at the end of games? And she said, well, it's a whole team issue, because those breakdowns further up the field sort of cause that. Talk about just like the mental discipline of having your toughest test, especially as a backline player, trying to just deal with pressure you haven't faced before.
Yeah, well, I think that's where discipline. If there's anything about like the best defensive players that you see in the world, or the best defensive lines, or even your back 5, if you want to include your goalie in that, they're going to be the most disciplined team. Like, not one of them is going to get pulled out unnecessarily, right? Like, they're always going to have pressure cover balance, like, across the board. And you'll see that. So I think that in games like today, that's the biggest thing, is like, it is not one player in the defensive line. Whereas like when you're talking about the attack, you can talk about single players oftentimes, and even single players can create the chaos earlier, like higher up on the field, even defensively, and that can lead to goals. But if that one player goes and the whole back line doesn't go with them, then you're talking about being exposed in certain ways. So I think discipline is the biggest thing that hopefully they've had the preseason to work through any bits of that. And today is the day that they're really going to need to show up, because honestly, if Minnesota does get a win today, I think that bodes very well for them going into the later half of even conference play, going into, the later half of the season. And conference play really does show like now we're into the
Right.
heart of the season, right? We're out of
Right.
our preseason play. Now we're into the heart of the season, and this is where games really, your win losses really start to matter.
Right.
So, you know, for me today, if I were Coach Chastain, if I were the defensive line, I would be making sure that the players around me, the players right next to me were on the same page the whole
Right.
time. You know, the rest of
Right.
the field can do what they need to do up the field, and we're going to be
Right.
with them, right? But yeah, it's kind of the players next to me that I'm most concerned about.
Yeah. Well, and as you said, like on offense, soccer can be a bit of a strong link game of like, does one impact player make the difference in a positive way? On the defensive end, it's regularly a weak link game where like one mistake means, so like, who is your weakest link back there? Are you making sure that as a team you don't create a weak link, like all those things? And I think you mentioned the conference play. It's for a team like Minnesota, they entered this weekend at like 169 in the RPI. So for a team like that, like you're never really going to climb out of that hole and get an at-large bid. Your possibility to advance is through the conference tournament, and the conference tournament has been a big goal for this team because last year, you know, several unfortunate results in the final 5 games meant they fell all the way out of Big Ten tournament contention. And so their goal this year is we have to be a top 8 team. Like you have to get in conference tournament play, and then hopefully things matchups fall the right way or whatever. And if you make a deep run there, you know, that's where your possibility is. So I think you're right. I think it's every game can be huge. Every game can, you know, drive some of that. And so yeah, we'll see how the Gophers match up. I will say one stat to watch is Minnesota has still not given up a goal in the first half to anybody. But they also very regularly sort of fail to get on the board first as well. And so I think like many of these Big Ten games, who is able to come out and pounce on an opportunity early is so huge, because then the other team is forced to come at you and open up space for you. So I think watch for who is able to pounce on an early opportunity. Like, for example, Minnesota has like the 10th most corner kicks in the entire country. And the only time they ever convert those is when Gabby Cesaroni just gets on the end of it. She has 3 corner kick goals. Can they get an early corner, and can she be an early hero for Minnesota today? So look out for Gabby, the D3 transfer, who we love so much.
Well, and I do think that there is something like a lot of times, especially on these Sunday games, it's hard to get up and have the mentality of being like, we're going to get at this right away from the whistle, because it's not under the lights. You don't have your crowd, you know, you don't have all of these things kind of that are extrinsic factors. So it's a lot of like, you know, internal motivation. I think that is something that is typical in women's college soccer. And I think if somebody breaks out of that and is able to get an early goal, that often does lead to a win. So I think you're spot on with that.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how it goes. Minnesota hosting Northwestern, kickoff in just a few moments at 1 p.m. Danny, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.